There is a particular kind of fall that only happens to something genuinely great. Not the quiet fade of something never much to begin with, the kind that leaves a mark, the kind people are still talking about years later, because what was lost was real enough to keep hurting. Tokyo Ghoul was real. In the summer of 2014, it arrived with a premise that cut straight to something true. A boy who wakes up as something the world has decided to destroy, who belongs nowhere, and has to figure out what he is before everything falls apart. It had a song that spread across the internet within days. An image, white hair, a cracked mask, a face that could not come back from what it had seen, that became one of the most recognized symbols in anime. And then, season by season, it let all of that go, trading depth for speed and character weight for the appearance of plot. This is the story of how that happened, and what, somehow, survived it. Welcome to Anabrain. Let's get started. Section 1. The world that waited for Tokyo Ghoul. There is a particular feeling that comes just before something arrives that changes the way a whole community thinks about a medium. A kind of restlessness, a quiet tension sitting underneath the surface of things, a sense that the audience has grown past what it is being given and is waiting, without knowing exactly what it is waiting for. That feeling was very present in the anime world in the years just before 2014. Something had shifted in the people watching. Fans were not satisfied with the same kinds of stories they had been given for years. They wanted darker material. They wanted moral weight. They wanted series that did not look away when things became difficult, that did not wrap their endings in clean resolutions that cost nothing. And just before Tokyo Ghoul arrived to answer all of that, one show above all others had fundamentally changed what the global anime audience believed this medium was capable of. Attack on Titan premiered in April 2013. What it did to the worldwide anime community in the months that followed is genuinely difficult to overstate. It did not just find an audience, it created one. It introduced millions of people who had never watched anime seriously to the idea that this medium could be frightening in a way that felt real and considered. The characters the audience cared about could die without warning. That the world inside a story did not have to feel safe or fair or kind. It was brutal in a way that felt purposeful rather than cheap. It carried enormous scale and atmosphere. It had a kind of relentless pressure in its pacing that made it almost impossible to stop watching once it had started. By the time its first season ended in September 2013, it had become a genuine cultural event, discussed not just within anime circles but in mainstream entertainment media across multiple countries. New fans poured into the anime community in numbers that were visible and significant. Many of them came specifically because Attack on Titan had shown them something they had not expected to find in animation. They came because it had proven the medium was serious. The problem for those new fans was that the second season of Attack on Titan was not coming anytime soon. The manga was still running. The production required time and care. And so a massive, restless audience was left looking for something that could give them a comparable feeling. Something with genuine weight behind it. Something with darkness that had a purpose. Something that asked real questions about identity and survival and what it means to be human in a world that has already decided what you are before you have had a chance to speak. That appetite was not subtle. It was visible in the conversations happening in online communities, in the kinds of series fans were recommending to each other, in the consistent, repeating demand for more of what Attack on Titan had provided. The anime industry was aware of this. The summer 2014 anime season arrived into that environment with several interesting titles competing for attention. But one of them had something the others did not. It had the right premise, the right atmosphere, and a visual identity that communicated its intentions clearly from the very first promotional image. Tokyo Ghoul, even before its premiere, was sending signals that felt different from the average seasonal anime. The visual design was striking in a way that seemed deliberate and considered rather than incidental. The color palette leaned toward grays and muted tones broken by sudden, vivid red. The character designs had an elegance to them, a sharpness in the line work that matched the tone of what the story was promising. The premise itself, a world where creatures indistinguishable from humans secretly lived among them and survived by consuming human flesh, had a moral complexity built directly into its foundation. These were not monsters living in caves or separate realms. They were neighbors. They were people working alongside humans in offices and coffee shops. They had families and grief and fear and a social structure of their own. They had to hide every day just to survive. The organization hunting them, the CCG, the Commission of Counter Ghoul, was not an obvious villain either. It was staffed by people who had real reasons for doing what they did, who had often lost someone they loved to Ghoul attacks, who believed sincerely in the necessity of their work. The conflict at the center of the story was not a clean battle between good and evil. It was something more uncomfortable than that. A collision between two groups of people who were both, in different ways, trying to survive. That kind of layered storytelling was exactly what the post-Attack on Titan audience had been searching for. They had tasted moral ambiguity. They had seen what dark storytelling looked like when it was handled with intelligence. They were not going to be satisfied with something simpler. Tokyo Ghoul's premise suggested it understood that. The promotional material suggested it understood that. The source material, which many fans had already encountered through the manga, confirmed it emphatically. It is also worth sitting with what the anime landscape looked like at a broader level in this period. Dark psychological anime had always had an audience, but it was not yet the dominant commercial force that it would later become. Death Note had proven years earlier that a morally complicated, psychologically intense anime could achieve massive mainstream success well beyond the traditional anime fanbase. Parasite was in development and would premiere later in 2014. Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, which had finished its run in 2010, had already established a high standard for what a faithful, well-resourced adaptation could achieve. These were the reference points the audience was carrying. They knew what great dark anime looked like. They had specific examples of it done correctly, and they were watching closely when Tokyo Ghoul arrived, because everything about it suggested it might belong in that same conversation. Studio Pierrot was the studio handling the adaptation. This was a name the anime community recognized immediately. Pierrot had been operating for decades. Naruto had run under their banner for years. Bleach had run under their banner. They were not a small or unfamiliar operation. They had the infrastructure, the experience, and the resources to handle a high-profile property. Director Shuhei Morita was leading the first season, and his background included work that pointed toward genuine artistic ambition. His short film, Possessions, had received an Academy Award nomination, which was not a typical credential for a television anime director. That combination, a capable studio with a track record and a director with artistic credibility, made the project feel like it was being treated with seriousness. The timing between the manga and the anime added another layer of apparent advantage. Sui Ishida's original Tokyo Ghoul manga had been running in weekly Young Jump since September 2011. By January 2014, when the anime was announced, the manga was very close to its conclusion. It would finish in September 2014, the same month the anime's first season ended. This meant the adaptation team was not working blind. They were not chasing a story that had not yet determined where it was going. The full shape of the narrative was essentially visible: the beginning, the middle, the emotional arc, the direction of the ending. Unlike Attack on Titan, which had been adapted while the manga was still very much in progress and required significant decisions to be made without knowing what the source material would eventually do, Tokyo Ghoul's adaptation had access to a nearly complete story. Every major character arc, every thematic thread, every key plot development was already on the page. That should have been a profound structural advantage. A studio adapting a finished or nearly finished work does not have to guess. It does not have to invent. It does not have to make risky creative decisions about material that the original author is still figuring out. The map already existed. All that was required was the willingness to follow it carefully. That advantage, as the years would eventually reveal, was not used in the way it should have been. But in the months before the premiere, none of that was visible yet. What was visible was a confluence of favorable conditions that felt genuinely promising. An enormous, engaged audience that had been primed by Attack on Titan to accept and hunger for exactly this kind of story. A studio with the scale to handle a serious production. A director whose background suggested something beyond routine competence. A source material that had already proven its power with manga readers across 3 years of serialization. A premiere date set for July 4th, 2014. A moment that felt, for all reasonable, observable reasons, like the beginning of something that would matter. The world had been waiting, and something was finally arriving to meet it. Whether that arrival would honor what the moment deserved was a question that would take more than one season to answer. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 1 laid out the landscape that received Tokyo Ghoul. The hunger in the audience, the changed expectations, the perfectly timed moment. But a good moment is only half the story. The other half belongs to the source material itself, and to the man who built it from a single competition entry into one of the most widely read manga series in modern history. Section 2. Sui Ishida and the manga that started everything. Before there was an anime, before there was a song called Unravel moving through millions of screens and earbuds in late-night bedrooms, before there was a white-haired boy with a cracked mask whose image would appear on convention floors from Tokyo to Sao Paulo to London, before any of that, there was a single one-shot manga entry submitted to a competition by a young artist who was not yet a professional. His name was Sui Ishida. The competition was the weekly Young Jump Grand Prix. The year was 2010. He submitted a story called Tokyo Ghoul. He won. And what started as a contest entry became, within the space of a few years, one of the best-selling manga franchises in the history of the medium. A story that would be read by tens of millions of people across the world and leave a mark on anime culture that is still visible today. Understanding who Ishida is as a creator matters deeply for understanding what Tokyo Ghoul was built to be. He is not someone who came to the project with years of professional experience behind him. Tokyo Ghoul was his debut. The manga that would eventually sell over 47 million copies worldwide was the work through which he learned, in real time, under the pressure of professional weekly serialization, how to be a mangaka. That is an unusual and important fact. Weekly Young Jump is not a forgiving environment. It is one of Japan's most competitive manga magazines, running alongside established titles and expecting its creators to deliver high-quality, consistent work on a schedule that leaves very little room for hesitation or recovery. For Ishida, every chapter of Tokyo Ghoul was simultaneously a creative act and a test of endurance. He has spoken in interviews and public statements about the physical and emotional cost of that process, about health struggles during the run, about the relentless pressure of weekly deadlines applied to a story that was also, at its core, a deeply personal exploration of identity and pain. The conditions under which he built this world shaped the kind of work it became. It is work that has suffering embedded in its structure, not as decoration, but as something the creator understood from the inside. The manga began serialization on September 8, 2011. The story introduced Ken Kaneki as its central figure. He is a quiet young man, a college student who spends more time with books than with people, who is gentle by nature and somewhat removed from the social world around him. He is not exceptional in the ways that typically mark a manga protagonist. He is not physically powerful. He is not strategically brilliant. He is simply a person trying to live a small and ordinary life. That ordinariness is deliberate and important. It is what makes everything that happens to him land with the weight that it does. On a date with a woman named Rise Kamishiro, everything changes. Rise is a ghoul. The date is a trap. She attacks him with every intention of killing and consuming him. A freak accident intervenes before she can finish. Steel beams from a nearby construction site fall on her and kill her. Kaneki is left critically injured and taken to a hospital, where a surgeon transplants Rise's organs into him to save his life. The surgery succeeds. Kaneki lives. But what he wakes up to is not the life he had before. He cannot eat normal food anymore. His body rejects everything except human flesh. His eyes have changed. Strength that did not belong to him before now does. He has become something that has not existed before in the world of the story. A half-ghoul. Half the person he was. Half the creature that tried to kill him. Belonging fully to neither world and accepted by neither side without complication or cost. That premise, rendered in summary, sounds like the starting point for a fairly conventional dark fantasy story. What separated it from that category in practice was the specific quality of attention Ishida paid to the moral architecture of his world. He was not interested in a simple conflict between heroes and monsters. He did not structure the CCG, the government organization tasked with hunting and exterminating ghouls, as a straightforward antagonist force. The investigators who populate the CCG are given genuine interiority. Characters like Kotaro Amon, a CCG investigator who becomes one of the series' most important recurring figures, are shown to be principled, grief-carrying people who believe sincerely in the necessity of their work. Amon has lost people he loved to ghoul attacks. He operates within a system he trusts because that system gave him a purpose after loss. He is not wrong that ghouls kill humans. He is not wrong that the city requires protection. What the story asks the reader to sit with is the question of what that protection costs, and who pays the price, and whether the categories of human and monster are as clean and reliable as the institutions built around them insist. Ghouls in Tokyo Ghoul are not mindless killing machines. They are people with culture, community, fear, and grief of their own. They are forced to feed on humans because there is no alternative. They cannot eat anything else. Many of them minimize the harm they cause as much as their biology allows. The coffee shop Anteiku, where Kaneki finds a kind of fragile second home after his transformation, is run by a ghoul named Yoshimura, who has spent decades trying to build something like a peaceful existence for ghouls who do not want to kill more than survival demands. The ghouls who gather there are not monsters by desire. They are people in an impossible situation, trying to hold on to something like dignity, while a world that does not see them as human hunts them for existing. Ishida placed Kaneki at the center of this conflict, precisely because a half-ghoul has no natural side. He experiences both worlds from within. He understands what it feels like to be hunted. He also understands what it feels like to have been fully human, and to know exactly what is being lost on both sides of every confrontation. The visual language Ishida developed for the manga reinforced all of this with unusual consistency. His art style leaned toward high contrast and expressive line work, with a particular skill for rendering faces at moments of extreme emotional stress. The kagune, the biological structures that emerge from a ghoul's body and function as both weapons and identifying features, were designed to carry meaning beyond pure visual spectacle. Toka Kirishima's kagune took a wing-like form that suited her controlled aggression and the way she moved through conflict. Kaneki's kagune, as his identity fractured and reformed across the story's arcs, shifted and evolved in ways that tracked his psychological state, rather than simply escalating in power. Even minor ghoul characters were given kagune designs that felt specific rather than generic. This was a world where the visual details were doing narrative work. The mask designs deserve particular attention. Ghouls in Tokyo Ghoul wear masks when they feed or fight, to protect their identities from the CCG. Ishida designed these masks with a range and creativity that made them immediately iconic. But none of them landed with the cultural impact of Kaneki's mask. Half black, half white, with a single eye visible on the white side, and the suggestion of a stitched or cracked seam running down the center. It was, in a single image, a perfect visual statement about everything the character was dealing with. Two halves, neither complete without the other. A division running through the center of something that was once a single, unified thing. Readers understood what that image meant without needing it explained. It moved from the pages of the manga into the wider world almost immediately. The original manga concluded in September 2014, after 143 chapters collected into 14 volumes. A sequel, Tokyo Ghoul, Rei, began almost immediately, launching in October 2014 and running until July 2018 across 179 chapters and 16 volumes. The combined franchise, original series and sequel together, represented 7 continuous years of Ishida's working life. The commercial results of that sustained effort were remarkable. Over 47 million copies in circulation worldwide by January 2021. Rankings among the best-selling manga series ever published. A readership that spanned age groups, countries, and levels of familiarity with the manga medium. What makes those numbers more than just impressive statistics is that they reflect genuine emotional investment from a global audience. People did not read Tokyo Ghoul casually and move on without it leaving a mark. They argued about it. They revisited it. They followed Ishida's subsequent work with Chojin X, with the specific attentiveness of readers who had been shaped by something and wanted to understand the mind behind it. The manga built that kind of loyalty because it was built with honesty. Ishida was not writing to a formula. He was writing a story about being forced into an identity you did not choose, about trying to maintain something human inside you when everything around you is pushing toward a version of yourself you do not recognize. Those themes were not decorative. They were structural. They were the reason the story worked at the level it did. Ishida's own retrospective feelings about the work, expressed in a public livestream that circulated widely in the fan community, were striking in their complexity. He described the manga in terms that surprised many people, speaking about it not as a success he was proud of, but as something he was grateful people had encountered at all. He acknowledged feeling uncertain about whether it had achieved what he hoped. He called the fans' frustration with certain aspects of it a kind of luxury, a word choice that carried a particular kind of exhausted generosity in its meaning. Here was someone whose work had reached tens of millions of people, who spoke about that reach with something closer to quiet disbelief than triumph. That response makes more sense when you understand the conditions under which the work was produced. 7 years of weekly deadlines, real health consequences, a story that required him to build a world of suffering with enough care that the suffering felt true rather than performed. He gave a significant portion of himself to this project. The fact that the anime adaptation would go on to mishandle so much of what he built adds a particular texture to those reflective statements. He created something real. What happened to it afterward was not entirely within his control. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The manga gave Tokyo Ghoul its soul, its moral weight, its visual identity, and its emotional honesty. Now it needed someone to carry all of that onto the screen. In the summer of 2014, Studio Pierrot made its attempt, and for 12 episodes, it came closer to succeeding than many people now remember. Section 3. Season 1 and the promise it made. There is a specific kind of excitement that builds in an anime community when something premieres and the first episode is genuinely good. Not just competent, not just promising in an abstract way that requires patience and goodwill to sustain. Actually good, in the immediate, undeniable sense where people who watched it are telling other people to watch it before the credits have finished rolling. That was what happened on July 4th, 2014, when the first episode of Tokyo Ghoul aired on Tokyo MX. Within hours, the conversations had started. Within days, the viewing numbers were climbing. Within weeks, it was clear that something real had arrived in the summer anime season. Something that was not going to stay quietly within the anime community, but was going to move outward into broader cultural spaces. That first episode did what first episodes are supposed to do and rarely manage. It made the audience feel that the world it was entering was one worth staying in for as long as the story would allow. The opening sequence deserves attention before anything else, because it set a tone that the rest of the first season worked to sustain. Before the story began properly, before Ken Kaneki was introduced as a person, before the world of ghouls and the CCG had been explained, the audience heard Unravel. The song was written and performed by TK from Ling Toside Segure, a musician known in Japan for a distinctive style that blended post-rock intensity with a kind of fragile, searching quality in the vocal performance. Unravel was released as a single on July 23, 2014, though it debuted in the first episode as an ending theme, before moving to its position as the opening from the second episode onward. The song had an unusual quality for an anime theme. It did not function as a hype piece. It did not build toward an explosive chorus designed to pump up the viewer before the action started. It was melancholic and searching, and slightly fractured in its construction, mirroring the internal state of a character who had been split in two and was trying to understand what he had become. The lyrics, translated from Japanese, spoke directly to Kaneki's experience without ever naming him. Questions about who is living inside you, the feeling of being broken in a world that does not notice, the terror of becoming transparent and disappearing. For viewers who took the time to translate and read them, the lyrics added a layer of meaning to the show that deepened everything they were watching. The song spread across the internet with a speed that few anime themes manage. Fan covers appeared on YouTube within weeks of the premiere. Acoustic versions, piano arrangements, full orchestral renditions. The song attracted musicians who had not previously engaged with anime music at all, drawn to it by its genuine compositional quality rather than its association with a popular property. It peaked at number 9 on the Oricon singles chart in Japan. It became a reference point in discussions about what anime opening themes could accomplish when they were built with actual intention rather than produced as afterthoughts. Years later, long after the complicated history of the anime adaptation had played out, Unravel remained. Conventions still play it. Covers still accumulate millions of views. It became what very few pieces of music tied to any specific property managed to become, something that outlives its original context and functions as a standalone cultural artifact. The visual design of the opening sequence matched the song's emotional register with precision. The animation moved between delicate and violent in ways that communicated the show's central tension without spelling it out. Kaneki was shown in states of fragmentation, of dissolving and reforming, of existing between two conditions that did not comfortably coexist. The color work in these sequences, heavy on blacks and whites with sudden intrusions of red, established the visual grammar the series would use throughout. Director Shuhei Morita and his team made choices in that opening that required confidence. They trusted the audience to absorb tone and implication, rather than needing everything explained in the first few minutes. That trust would become one of the defining qualities of the first season at its best. The story the first season was adapting covered approximately the first 66 chapters of Ishida's manga, collected across roughly the first 7 volumes. This included Kaneki's initial transformation, his gradual and painful adjustment to his new reality, his introduction to Anteiku and the community of ghouls who would become something close to a family for him, his encounters with the CCG investigators whose paths kept crossing his own, and the escalating threat of Aogiri Tree, a violent ghoul organization whose operations began pulling every part of the story toward a confrontation that the season would build toward across its 12 episodes. Pacing across this material was quick. 12 episodes to cover 66 chapters is a compressed ratio, and some of the finer details from the manga, certain character interactions, some of the more nuanced world-building moments did not make it into the adaptation. Manga readers noticed these omissions. Some of them mattered more than others. But the first season moved through its material with enough skill and enough fidelity to the emotional core of the source that the omissions felt like the expected costs of adaptation rather than evidence of disrespect toward the material. The character of Ken Kaneki was handled with particular care in these 12 episodes. Natsuki Hanai voiced him in the Japanese language version, and the performance carried genuine range across a season that required Kaneki to be, at different points, vulnerable and frightened, quietly hopeful, deeply confused, and finally broken and rebuilt in ways that the character and the audience were not fully prepared for. Kaneki's arc in the first season moved from ordinary student to something that no longer fit cleanly into any category, and Hanai tracked that movement without making any single stage feel rushed or unearned. The scenes at Anteku, where Kaneki slowly found a rhythm with Toka Kirishima and Yoshimura and the others gathered there, were given enough room to breathe that the relationships felt real. The audience needed to care about these people before the violence came for them. The first season understood that and did the work to make it true. The character of Toka Kirishima requires its own moment of attention because the first season established her with a specificity that the later seasons would significantly diminish. Sora Amamiya voiced Toka with a controlled ferocity that communicated everything the character needed to communicate. Toka is not warm in the conventional sense. She is sharp, direct, and frequently hostile in ways that have reasons behind them that the story reveals gradually. She has survived things that would have destroyed someone less determined. She is angry in the way that people are angry when they have spent years being afraid and have learned to convert fear into something more manageable. The first season gave her enough scenes to establish that complexity. Enough moments where the armor she wore shifted slightly and something more fragile showed through. She was not a supporting character decorating Kaneki's story. She was a person with her own history and her own ongoing struggle, and the first season treated her like one. The torture arc, which unfolded across the final episodes of the first season, deserves careful attention because it is the sequence that most people who watched the show in 2014 still remember most vividly. Kaneki was captured by Yamori, a ghoul known as Jason, a figure whose reputation for sadism had been established earlier in the season. What Jason did to Kaneki over the course of his captivity was the kind of sustained psychological and physical horror that the manga had depicted with brutal precision. The anime, constrained by broadcasting standards, could not reproduce that precision directly. Much of the torture was suggested rather than shown, obscured by darkened frames, color inversions, and camera angles that implied the violence without depicting it fully. The censorship was visible and sometimes frustrating, particularly for manga readers who knew exactly what was being covered over. But even in its compromised form, the sequence accomplished what it needed to accomplish. It communicated the weight and duration of what Kaneki endured. It made the audience understand that something was being done to him that could not simply be recovered from, that the person who came out of that room was not going to be the same person who went into it. The mechanism by which Kaneki survived was one of the manga's most psychologically precise inventions. Trapped and in agony, he forced himself to count backward from 1,000 to prevent himself from losing consciousness, because losing consciousness would mean a brief escape from the pain, and Jason extended his torture by monitoring exactly that threshold. The counting became a kind of meditation on survival under conditions that should have been unsurvivable. And in the depths of that ordeal, Kaneki had an internal confrontation with an imagined version of Rize, the ghoul whose organs had transformed him, that forced him to reckon with everything he had been refusing to accept about what he was. He emerged from that confrontation having made a decision. He was not going to keep trying to protect everyone else at the cost of himself. He was not going to keep pretending that his human half was the only half that mattered. He accepted what he was, fully and without apology, and his hair turned white. That image, Kaneki with white hair, sitting in the wreckage of his captivity, something different behind his eyes. It became one of the most widely shared images in anime fan culture almost immediately. The before and after of it, the dark-haired, gentle student, and the white-haired person who had decided to stop running, communicated the season's entire emotional arc in a single visual. It appeared in fan art, in profile pictures, in convention cosplay, in YouTube thumbnails, in discussions about character development and trauma and transformation that had nothing specifically to do with anime. It reached people who had not watched the show and made them curious about it. It functioned as exactly the kind of iconic moment that a dark, character-driven story produces when everything is working together correctly. When the story and the animation and the voice performance and the music all arrive at the same point simultaneously and produce something that exceeds the sum of its parts. The first season ended with the Anteiku raid, the CCG's large-scale assault on the coffee shop that had been Kaneki's refuge. It was a conclusion that carried genuine cost. Characters who had been given enough screen time to matter were placed in real danger. The outcome was not clean. What was left at the end of the 12 episodes was a world that felt genuinely changed by what had happened inside it. A set of characters who would carry the weight of the season's events forward, and an audience that was deeply invested in what would come next. Manga readers had a reasonable expectation that what would come next was an adaptation of the material that followed in the source, the arcs that deepened every major character and pushed the story's thematic concerns into more complex territory. Anime-only viewers simply knew that they were not ready to stop watching. Both groups were waiting for the same thing, even if they were imagining it differently. Season 1 of Tokyo Ghoul was not a perfect adaptation. The pacing compromises were real. Some character development was thinner than the manga warranted. The censorship blunted the impact of moments that were designed to be visceral. These were legitimate criticisms, and manga readers made them clearly and consistently. But legitimate criticism of an imperfect thing is different from the rejection of something that failed. The first season did not fail. It succeeded in the ways that matter most. It built a world the audience wanted to inhabit. It built characters the audience genuinely cared about. It told the first portion of Ishida's story with enough fidelity to its emotional core that the audience could feel what the story was really about beneath its genre surface. And it sent 12 episodes out into the world that made millions of people want more. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the entire promise an adaptation is supposed to make. The first season made it. What happened next was something else entirely. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Season 1 built something real. It earned the trust of an enormous audience and sent them into the wait for more with genuine excitement. What arrived to meet that excitement just a few months later in January 2015 was a decision that nobody fully saw coming and that the franchise never fully recovered from. Section 4. Kaneki's transformation and the torture arc. There are moments in a story that announce themselves quietly before they arrive. Small signals in the episodes leading up to them, a shift in pacing, a change in how the camera treats a character, a musical choice that introduces a note of dread underneath what is still, technically, a manageable situation. Tokyo Ghoul's first season was full of these signals in its middle episodes. The world had been established. The characters had been given enough screen time that the audience had genuine feelings about them. The stakes had been raised steadily across 10 episodes, to the point where something significant felt imminent without it being entirely clear what form that significance would take. And then the show arrived at the sequence that the first season had been building toward, without quite naming it. The sequence that separated Tokyo Ghoul from the large category of dark anime that uses darkness as visual texture without following it to where it actually leads. The torture arc. Kaneki in captivity under Yamori. 12 episodes. And this was where everything the season had promised either proved itself or did not. It proved itself. Not without compromises. Not without the visible marks of censorship requirements that blunted certain edges, but fundamentally and unmistakably. The arc proved that the show understood its own central character at a level that most seasonal anime do not understand their protagonists. It proved that the psychological framework Ishida had built in the manga was not simply decoration applied to an action story, but the actual load-bearing structure of the narrative. And it produced, in its closing moments, an image that entered the visual vocabulary of the anime community and has not left it in the decades since. To understand why the arc hit with the force it did, it is necessary to understand where Kaneki was before it began. Not just narratively, in terms of where the plot had positioned him, but psychologically, in terms of the specific internal logic he had been operating under across the first 7 or 8 episodes of the season. Kaneki was not trying to become a powerful ghoul. He was not positioning himself as a significant player in the conflict between the ghoul community and the CCG. He was not building toward anything that could be called ambition in the conventional sense. He was trying to protect people. That was the entirety of his project. He had found Anteiku, the coffee shop run by Yoshimura that served as a gathering place for ghouls who wanted something other than a life organized around violence. He had found Tuka and Hinami, and the loose community of people who had accepted him without requiring him to resolve the contradiction at the center of what he was. And having found that, he had organized himself entirely around keeping it safe. This is a pattern that the story treated with a great deal of psychological honesty. The person who absorbs all the cost so that the people they love do not have to. The person who keeps saying they are fine, who keeps stepping between everyone else and whatever is coming, who has made a private decision that their own suffering is an acceptable price for others' safety. It is a recognizable pattern and not an uncommon one, and it is usually presented in stories as a form of heroism because it looks like selflessness from the outside. What Ishida understood, and what the arc made explicit, was that this pattern is not simply selflessness. It is also a way of avoiding something. A person who cannot allow themselves to be protected, who insists on carrying everything alone, is not only generous, they are also afraid. Afraid of what it means to need people, afraid of what it would cost others to actually help them, afraid, at the deepest level, of the implications of being someone worth helping. Kaneki's protectiveness was real and genuine. His care for the people around him was not performed. But beneath it was a structure that was going to break under sufficient pressure, and the story knew this from the beginning. Aogiri Tree applied that pressure. The violent ghoul organization whose activities had been moving closer to the center of the story across the season's middle episodes captured Kaneki. The character responsible for what followed was Yamori, known as Jason, a figure whose reputation within the story's world had been established in careful increments before his face was given significant screen time. He was feared by other ghouls, which in a world where ghouls are already feared by humans meant something specific. He occupied a category of cruelty that even people accustomed to violence recognized as exceptional. And the reason for that exceptionalism was not simple sadism, though sadism was certainly present. It was expertise. Yamori knew things about the experience of suffering that most people do not know, because he had been made to learn them. His own history was part of what gave the arc its particular psychological texture. Yamori had been tortured himself during a period of captivity earlier in his life. The experience had not simply traumatized him. It had educated him. He had come out of it understanding, from the inside, the specific mechanisms by which a person can be broken. He understood the relationship between consciousness and pain, the way the mind seeks unconsciousness as an escape, and the way that escape can be denied by someone who knows where the threshold is. He understood the difference between pain that produces shock, which is a form of dissociation and a kind of mercy, and pain applied at a sustained level that keeps the mind fully present without allowing it to retreat. He had turned that understanding into a practice. What he did to the people he captured was not random or impulsive. It was systematic in a way that the word torture does not quite capture. It was closer to a method for getting inside a person and finding out what was actually there. What he found in Kaneki was more than he expected, and more than Kaneki himself knew was there. The counting backward from 1000 is the detail that has stayed with people the longest from this arc. And understanding why it works requires understanding what it represents. Yamori monitored the threshold between Kaneki's consciousness and unconsciousness deliberately. Losing consciousness would have meant a temporary escape from the experience, a brief interruption in the continuous present tense of the suffering. Yamori did not permit that interruption. He kept Kaneki at the threshold, brought him back each time he approached it, extended the duration of full presence indefinitely. The counting was Kaneki's response to this condition, a way of maintaining the mental focus necessary to stay present, to keep the mind oriented, to prevent the dissolution of self that extreme suffering tends to produce. It was not a coping mechanism in any comfortable sense. It was the opposite of comfort. Counting backward from 1000, maintaining the sequence, keeping track of where you are in it, requires a specific kind of cognitive engagement that keeps the mind from simply stopping. It was a way of surviving that felt like the worst possible version of surviving, present for everything, unable to leave, holding on to the self by its fingernails. The anime's handling of this sequence was shaped by the censorship requirements of broadcast television in Japan in ways that produced something genuinely interesting and genuinely frustrating in roughly equal measure. Tokyo Ghoul was airing on Tokyo MX and several other channels, and the graphic content that Ishida had put on the page in the manga could not be reproduced directly within broadcast standards. The production responded with a toolkit of visual strategies that have become, in retrospect, somewhat definitional to discussions of the series. Color inversion transformed the palette of certain scenes into their opposite, a technique that communicated that something extreme was happening without showing it directly. Frames were darkened until the action within them became mostly shadow. Camera angles were chosen to show reactions rather than actions, to show Kaneki's face rather than what was being done to it. The sound design was asked to carry the weight that the visuals were not permitted to carry, which it did with uneven success. The result was a sequence that communicated its emotional and psychological content, while obscuring its physical specificity. Manga readers watching these episodes knew what was behind the dark frames. They knew the details that were being covered over, the centipedes, the specific nature of the physical violations Yamori committed, the way the regenerative capacity of Kaneki's ghoul biology turned what would have been finite damage into something that could be sustained and repeated. They watched the censored version knowing exactly what it was censoring, and the gap between what they knew and what they were seeing produced a specific kind of frustration that was legitimate and widely expressed. For anime-only viewers, the sequence was still effective, still clearly communicating that something serious and lasting was happening to Kaneki, still building toward a breaking point that the narrative had been moving toward for weeks. But the full force of what Ishida had constructed was not available to them. The censorship was not catastrophic. The arc still worked, but it worked at something less than full strength. And the difference was real. There was a narrative compression in this section of the adaptation that had consequences beyond the immediate visual limitations. In the manga, Kaneki's captivity was populated with other figures whose presence added moral and emotional texture to his experience. Kazuichi Banjo and a small group of ghouls were also being held by Aogiri. They were not powerful. They were frightened people in a terrible situation, and Kaneki encountered them in the darkness of his captivity and formed bonds with them of the specific kind that form between people who are trying to survive something together. Those bonds mattered. When Kaneki eventually broke free, he was not simply escaping his own suffering. He was carrying obligations, the weight of having made promises to people who had trusted him in conditions where trust was very costly. The anime did not develop this dimension of the arc. The manga material involving Banjo's group was simplified into near absence, and what Kaneki carried out of his captivity in the anime version was consequently a somewhat lighter burden than what he carried in Ishida's original. The escape was still significant, but the significance was narrower. What the anime preserved with genuine care was the internal confrontation that sat at the psychological center of the arc, and that was ultimately more important than any of the external events surrounding it. In the depths of his captivity, somewhere between consciousness and something else entirely, Kaneki encountered a vision of Rize, the ghoul whose organs had transformed him. She had been present in his psychology since the beginning of the series as a figure he had not fully reckoned with, the origin of his transformation, the person he had tried to like and who had tried to eat him, the source of everything that had happened to him that he had not asked for. In this internal encounter, she was not gentle. She did not offer comfort or explanation. She pushed back against the story Kaneki had been telling himself about who he was and how he intended to get through what was happening to him. The specific argument she made was the argument the arc had been building toward from its beginning. She told him, in terms he could not deflect or rationalize away, that the structure of his selflessness was not strength. That a person who refuses to be protected is not generous. They are running from something. That the insistence on carrying everything, on absorbing all the damage so that the people around you do not have to, is a way of maintaining control in situations where being genuinely vulnerable to another person feels more dangerous than whatever the external threat is. She was right. And Kaneki, in the place he was, in the state he was in, could not find a way to disagree. The defenses were gone. The performance of being fine was gone. The carefully maintained distance between who he was and what was actually happening to him was gone. What remained was something closer to the truth of his situation than he had allowed himself to see before. From that confrontation came the decision that the arc had been building toward. He was going to stop. Stop absorbing everything. Stop pretending that the ghoul half of what he was could be managed or contained or kept separate from the human half that he had been trying to protect. Stop performing a version of himself that no longer had any relationship to what he actually was. He was going to accept what he was, the totality of it, without the performance, without the distance. And that acceptance, made in the dark of a room where someone had spent considerable time trying to destroy him, produced the most iconic visual moment the series ever generated. His hair turned white. The transformation was grounded in something real. Stress-induced changes in hair pigmentation have a documented basis in medical literature, a phenomenon where extreme physical or psychological stress can affect the melanin production responsible for hair color. Ishida used this as the foundation for a visual signal that communicated everything the arc had been building toward in a single image. The dark-haired Kaneki who had arrived in that room was the person who had been trying to hold himself together within a framework that the arc had now completely dismantled. The white-haired person who emerged from it had made a different accommodation with reality. Not a comfortable one, not a triumphant one. Something more complicated and more honest than triumph. A kind of acceptance that came from having had every alternative removed. The image spread immediately and widely. Fan art appeared within days of the episode airing. Profile pictures changed across anime communities. The before and after comparison, dark-haired, gentle student against white-haired person who had decided to stop running from what he was, communicated the entire arc of the season in a visual shorthand that required no explanation. People who had not watched the show encountered the image in online spaces and became curious about the story that had produced it. It became one of those rare visual moments in anime that escapes the community that generated it and enters broader cultural circulation, recognized by people whose engagement with the source material was minimal or non-existent. The mask, the white hair, the specific expression on the face of the person who emerged from that room. These images did not require context to read as meaningful. They were visually efficient in the way that the best character design always is, carrying their content in their form rather than depending on explanation to convey it. The torture arc was the moment that defined what the first season of Tokyo Ghoul was. Not in terms of its action or its horror, though both were present, but in terms of its willingness to follow its central idea to where it actually led. To take a character who had been built with genuine care over 10 episodes and put him in a place where everything the audience understood about him was stripped away, and something different emerged from the stripping. To do that honestly, without softening it more than the censorship requirements demanded, without pulling back from the psychological specificity that made it more than an exciting dark moment in an exciting dark show. The first season proved in these episodes that it understood what kind of story it was telling. That understanding was real and it was earned. What came next would demonstrate, with painful clarity, that the people making subsequent decisions about the franchise did not share it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The torture arc gave the series its most enduring image and its most psychologically complete moment. It sent the audience into the wait for Season 2, carrying a specific and hard-earned trust. What arrived to meet that trust in January 2015 was something the audience was not prepared for. And the story of how it happened begins not with a creative failure, but with a decision. Section 5. The decision that changed everything. When a new anime season is announced, the conversation that follows usually moves through predictable stages. There is excitement. There is speculation about which story arcs will be covered, and how many episodes will be allocated to each. There is debate about casting and animation quality, and whether the pacing of the previous season will be corrected or repeated. The conversation is forward-looking and essentially optimistic, built on the assumption that what is coming will be a continuation of what came before in the same general spirit. When Tokyo Ghoul Route A was announced for a January 2015 premiere, that conversation started in the usual way. The audience was large and engaged and hungry for more. The first season had earned genuine goodwill. The source material for a second season was sitting there, rich and detailed and ready to be adapted. Everything pointed toward a continuation that would honor what had been built. Then the details began to emerge, and the conversation changed. The announcement that Route A would not be a direct continuation of the manga's story, that it would instead follow what was described as an alternate story, developed in collaboration with Sui Ishida, landed in the fan community with a confusion that quickly sharpened into alarm. Manga readers understood immediately what this meant in practical terms. The second half of the original Tokyo Ghoul manga, the material that would naturally follow from where the first season had ended, was rich with character development and plot progression that the first season had been building toward. It contained arcs that deepened every significant character who had been introduced. It contained revelations that recontextualized earlier events. It contained the specific story beats that manga readers had been waiting to see animated. The announcement that this material would not be adapted directly, that the anime was instead going to take the story somewhere else entirely, felt to those readers like something being taken from them without explanation. For anime-only viewers, the announcement carried a different kind of unease. They did not have the specific knowledge of what was being bypassed, but they could read the reaction of the manga community clearly enough, and what they were reading did not suggest that the alternate story direction was a cause for excitement. The conversation in online spaces in the weeks before Route A premiered was fractured in a way that the conversation before the first season had not been. Something had shifted. The unified anticipation that had characterized the lead-up to the first season had been replaced by a divided and somewhat anxious waiting. The story of how Route A came to exist is more complicated than the simple narrative of a studio overriding its source material suggests. Director Shuhei Morita conducted a Reddit AMA in 2018, shortly before the Tokyo Ghoul re-anime began airing, and his account of the Route A production provided details that reframed the situation significantly. According to Morita, the decision to take the anime in a different direction from the manga was not made unilaterally by Studio Pierrot. Ishida himself was involved in the process and had, in Morita's account, actively encouraged the creative team to explore a different path for the anime version of the story. The idea was not to ignore the manga, but to create something that could exist alongside it as a parallel telling, an alternate route to the same essential destination. Morita described the working relationship with Ishida in terms that suggested genuine creative exchange. He explained that when he asked Ishida how he wanted the first season to end, Ishida gave him a specific idea that Morita then worked from. For the second season, Ishida had proposed that the focus shift to white-haired Kaneki, the transformed version of the character who had emerged from the torture arc, and that this version of Kaneki joining Aogiri Tree serve as the emotional spine of the alternate story. The creative team had what Morita described as a large collection of ideas they wanted to explore within that framework. The ambition, as he characterized it, was genuinely interesting. A version of the Tokyo Ghoul story that used the same characters and the same world, but took different routes through the material, arriving at its ending through paths that the manga had not taken. The problem, as Morita also described it clearly, was that the ambition kept getting reduced. He spoke about a process in which the ideas the creative team had developed were progressively constrained by people above him in the production hierarchy. Every time the story moved towards something genuinely different or creatively bold, something that would have committed fully to the alternate telling, rather than hovering uncertainly between the manga's plot and an original narrative, pressure came from above to pull back. The concern, as Morita explained it, was about affecting the lore of the original manga. The production committee did not want the anime to go so far in its own direction that it created contradictions or complications for the manga's ongoing storyline. Tokyo Ghoul Rei, the sequel manga, had just launched in October 2014. The production committee was managing both properties simultaneously and was cautious about allowing the anime to make moves that might interfere with the manga's reception or readership. The result of that constraint was something that satisfied almost nobody. Route A ended up in a middle position that combined the worst qualities of both the faithful adaptation and the fully original story. It was not faithful enough to the manga to satisfy readers who wanted to see Ishida's actual story animated. A significant portion of the manga's second half, arcs containing character development that anime-only viewers would later desperately need in order to follow Tokyo Ghoul Rei, was simply not adapted. Characters who had been built carefully in the source material were reduced to background figures or removed from the narrative entirely. Kotaro Amon, whose arc in the manga ran parallel to Kaneki's in ways that deepened both characters, was given a fraction of the screen time he deserved. Eto Yoshimura, one of the most important figures in the broader story, was present but significantly underdeveloped. The investigators of the CCG, who had been one of the first season's genuine strengths, were sidelined in ways that flattened the moral complexity the story depended on. But Route A was also not original enough to function as a satisfying alternate telling. The ideas that Morita and his team had wanted to pursue, the genuinely different routes through the material, had been pruned back to the point where the season felt neither like the manga's story nor like a coherent story of its own. Kaneki's decision to join Aogiri Tree, the central premise of the alternate telling, was never given adequate explanation within the anime's own terms. Viewers watching Route A without knowledge of the manga were presented with a protagonist who made a major, character-defining decision and was never given the scene work necessary to make that decision feel motivated from the inside. It happened. The story moved forward as though it had happened for clear reasons, but those reasons were not on the screen in any form the audience could follow. The production committee's decision to limit the episode count added another layer of structural impossibility to the situation. Shueisha and the production committee had determined that Tokyo Ghoul would receive 2 seasons of 12 episodes each, 24 episodes total. That number was set before the creative decisions about story direction were fully resolved, and it created a container that was simply too small for the material being asked to fit inside it. The first season had already demonstrated the compression required to move through 66 manga chapters in 12 episodes. Route A was now being asked to cover a large portion of the remaining manga story, adapted through an alternate narrative lens, in another 12 episodes. The mathematics of that task were unkind before a single frame of animation had been produced. Morita's own statement about his experience on Route A is worth sitting with carefully. He said he did not have any regrets given the movement space he was allowed. That phrase, the movement space he was allowed, carries a specific kind of meaning. It is the language of someone describing a creative process that was constrained from outside in ways they could not fully control. He was not defending every decision made in Route A. He was acknowledging that many of the decisions that shaped the season were not entirely his to make. The production committee had the final authority. The concerns about the manga, about the lore, about the simultaneous management of the ongoing sequel shaped the season in ways that the creative team could push against but not override. The fan community's response to Route A as it aired was swift and largely negative among manga readers. Episode by episode, the specific omissions and deviations became clear. Story threads that readers knew were important were not being developed. Characters who should have been receiving significant arcs were appearing briefly or not at all. The alternate story material that did appear often felt disconnected from the emotional logic that the first season had carefully established. A particularly significant point of contention was the handling of Hideyoshi Nagachika, Kaneki's closest human friend. Hide appeared throughout Route A in ways that suggested the alternate story had something meaningful planned for him. The final episode depicted him dying in Kaneki's arms, a scene that was visually striking and emotionally weighted, but that arrived without the build-up necessary to make it land with the force it was reaching for. It was a conclusion to a story that had not been properly told, an emotional payoff for development that had not happened on screen. Anime-only viewers, who did not have the manga as a reference point, were left with something more confused than disappointed. They knew the season had not worked, even if they could not always identify specifically why. The feeling of watching characters make decisions that did not feel motivated, of following a plot that moved between events without adequately connecting them, of arriving at an ending that had weight without having earned it, was legible even without knowledge of what the source material had contained. Route A left its anime-only audience without the narrative foundation they would need to follow what came next. That problem would become much more visible and much more damaging when Tokyo Ghoul Re eventually arrived. The decision that shaped Route A was not a single moment of carelessness. It was the outcome of a production process in which multiple competing pressures, creative ambition, commercial caution, scheduling constraints, and the complex management of a franchise running across two simultaneous manga properties produced something that satisfied none of the goals it had been reaching for. The audience that had trusted the first season to be the beginning of something careful and sustained had been given instead a second season that demonstrated how quickly that trust could be spent. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Route A did not simply disappoint the audience. It left a specific kind of damage behind. Holes in the story, missing character development, unanswered questions that would shape everything that followed. Understanding what that damage actually looked like in concrete terms is where the next part of this story begins. Section 6. What Route A actually did to the story. Disappointment, when it arrives in the context of something people genuinely cared about, tends to produce two distinct responses. The first is emotional, the feeling of having expected something and received something lesser in its place. The second is analytical, the need to understand, specifically and concretely, what went wrong and why the gap between expectation and reality was as wide as it turned out to be. The fan community that had followed Tokyo Ghoul through its first season and into Route A experienced both of these responses simultaneously, and the analytical one produced conversations that were detailed, sustained, and often surprisingly precise. People who loved the source material were not simply venting frustration, they were cataloging. They were identifying, episode by episode and character by character, exactly what Route A had taken from the story and what it had left in place of what it removed. That catalog, assembled across forums and video essays and comment sections during and after the season's run, tells a specific and instructive story about how an adaptation can fail not through a single catastrophic decision, but through the accumulation of many smaller ones. The most immediate and widely discussed category of damage was character. Tokyo Ghoul's first season had introduced a large cast with enough care that most of the significant figures felt like people rather than plot functions. The CCG investigators in particular had been handled with a specificity that elevated the moral complexity of the whole story. When those characters were given genuine interiority, when their reasons for doing what they did were made visible and understandable, the conflict at the center of the narrative became something richer than a simple contest between sides. Route A systematically reduced that specificity in ways that were visible and consequential. Kotaro Amon was perhaps the most significant casualty of this reduction. In the manga, Amon's arc across the second half of the original story ran in genuine parallel to Kaneki's. Both characters were grappling with versions of the same fundamental question, the question of what it means to commit fully to a side in a conflict, when the evidence keeps suggesting that neither side has the complete truth. Amon had entered the CCG as a true believer, shaped by loss and by the mentorship of figures who had given his grief a direction. His encounters with Kaneki across the story's development began to complicate that belief, in ways the manga traced with patience and care. By the time the original manga reached its conclusion, Amon had been through an arc that meaningfully changed him. Route A gave him a fraction of that material. He appeared, he was present in several episodes, but the internal journey that made his presence matter in the manga was almost entirely absent from the anime. He became a figure moving through events, rather than a person being shaped by them. And the difference between those two things was the difference between a character and a costume. Eto Yoshimura presented a related but distinct problem. In the broader architecture of the Tokyo Ghoul story, Ito was one of the most important figures the series contained. Her relationship to the events of both the original manga and the sequel Tokyo Ghoul Re was deep and load-bearing in ways that the audience would only fully understand later. Route A introduced her, gave her a visual presence that suggested significance, and then did not develop her in any meaningful way. She was there, recognizably, as someone who mattered. But why she mattered, what her history was, what her relationship to the other major figures of the story meant for the direction of the conflict, none of that was given the space it required. For anime-only viewers, she registered as an interesting background figure whose importance they were presumably going to understand later. For manga readers, she registered as evidence of how much was being left on the table. The problem with leaving Ito underdeveloped in Route A extended beyond the immediate season. When Tokyo Ghoul Re eventually arrived in 2018, the audience was expected to engage with a story that built significantly on the history and motivations of characters like Ito. Viewers who had only watched the anime had no foundation for that engagement. They had been given a character's outline without her interior. When Tokyo Ghoul Re then asked them to care about what happened to that character, and to understand the significance of her role in the story's larger movement, many of them could not follow. The gaps that Route A had created were not gaps that Tokyo Ghoul Re was structured to fill. It assumed a viewer who knew the material it had skipped. That assumption was mistaken, and the consequences of the mistake were distributed across an entire subsequent season. The treatment of the Aogiri Tree organization illustrated a different dimension of the damage. In the manga, Aogiri Tree was not simply a collection of powerful and violent ghouls. It had an internal structure, a set of relationships and hierarchies and individual characters with their own histories and motivations that made it function as a genuine faction rather than a generalized threat. Characters like Tatara and Noro were not interchangeable menaces. They had specific roles within the organization and specific histories that connected to the broader story in ways that would become important later. Route A presented Aogiri Tree primarily as an atmospheric force. It was there. It was dangerous. It moved through the season, creating pressure and spectacle. But the specific details that would have made it a faction with comprehensible internal logic were not developed. The result was that scenes involving Aogiri Tree, particularly in the season's later episodes, often felt visually impressive but narratively opaque. Things were happening. Powerful characters were fighting and making decisions. But the meaning of what was happening, the specific weight of these events within the story's larger structure, was difficult to access without the context the adaptation had chosen not to provide. Kaneki's own arc in Route A suffered from a problem that was, in some ways, the most fundamental of all, because it sat at the center of everything the season was trying to do. The decision to have Kaneki join Aogiri Tree was the premise of the alternate story. It was the move that Route A had been built around, and it never received an adequate explanation within the anime's own terms. Kaneki joined Aogiri Tree. The season proceeded as though this made sense, but the internal logic that would have made it make sense, the specific reasoning that Kaneki himself was working from, the emotional and psychological state that led him to this choice rather than some other, was not given the scene work necessary to make it visible to the audience. Manga readers could import their knowledge of Kaneki's psychology from the source material and construct a reading of the decision that held together. Anime-only viewers had only what was on screen. And what was on screen was a protagonist making a major, character-defining choice for reasons that were implied rather than demonstrated. This created a cascading problem across the season's subsequent episodes. Every scene involving Kaneki within Algiri Tree, every interaction he had with the organization's members, every decision he made while nominally operating as part of their structure rested on a foundation of motivation that had not been properly established. The audience was watching a character act without fully understanding why he was acting, which meant the emotional engagement those scenes were designed to produce could not be fully achieved. There were individual moments of visual and atmospheric power scattered through Route A that worked in isolation. The animation in certain sequences took genuine risks and produced images that were striking on their own terms. But striking images sitting on top of an unstable narrative foundation cannot substitute for the foundation itself. They can produce a momentary impression. They cannot produce the sustained emotional investment that a story requires to make its ending matter. The final episode of Route A remains one of the most discussed and debated single episodes in the franchise's history, for reasons that illustrate almost everything that went wrong with the season as a whole. The episode depicted the CCG's raid on Anteiku, the coffee shop that had been the emotional center of the first season. Yoshimura, the ghoul who ran Anteiku and had served as something close to a father figure for Kaneki, was confronted and defeated. Characters who had been present throughout the season faced the consequences of the conflict that had been building. And in the episode's most significant moment, Kaneki carried Hide, his closest human friend, through the destruction. Hide was dying, or he appeared to be dying. The scene was shot with a visual delicacy that communicated loss and grief, and the specific weight of being the person left standing when someone you love is not. The moment reached for something genuinely moving, but the moment did not fully land for a large portion of the audience. And the reason it did not land was precisely the problem Route A had been building toward all season. Hyde's apparent death was presented as a major emotional event. It was scored and framed and paced like a major emotional event. The problem was that Route A had not done the work across its 12 episodes to make Hyde's presence in the story feel sufficiently significant that his loss could carry the weight the finale was asking it to carry. He had appeared in the season. He had been present in several scenes that suggested importance without delivering it. The relationship between him and Kaneki, which in the manga was one of the story's most carefully developed emotional threads, had been given insufficient space in Route A to accumulate the meaning it needed. The finale was asking the audience to feel the loss of something the season had not adequately shown them having. The animation quality across Route A was also a point of consistent criticism that deserves acknowledgement. The first season had demonstrated that Studio Pierrot, under Shuhei Morita's direction, could produce animation that was atmospheric and visually purposeful, that used its imagery to carry meaning rather than simply to fill screen time. Route A was uneven in ways that the first season had not been. Certain episodes and sequences maintained the visual standard the first season had established. Others showed the signs of a production under pressure, with shortcuts visible in the character movements and fight choreography that reduced the impact of scenes that needed to hit hard. The Anteiku raid, which should have been a sequence of sustained visual power, was inconsistent in ways that manga readers found frustrating, knowing what the equivalent scenes in the source material had looked like under Ishida's pen. What Route A left behind when it ended in March 2015 was a story with structural damage that was going to be very difficult to repair. The characters who had been underdeveloped were not going to become more accessible in retrospect. The plot threads that had been dropped were not going to reattach themselves. The anime-only viewers who had been left without adequate context for the story's major players were not going to acquire that context from anywhere except the manga, which many of them had not read and would not read. The damage was real, and it was specific, and it was the kind of damage that compounds over time rather than fading. Everything that came next would be built on top of it, and what came next had its own considerable set of problems to add to the weight. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Route A left behind a story with holes where its foundation should have been. Characters reduced to outlines, motivations left unexplained, an audience divided and confused. What came next required all of that damage to somehow be absorbed and moved past. It was not. And the story of how Tokyo Ghoul Re attempted the impossible and fell short of it begins with a gap of 3 years and a change of hands. Section 7. The long wait and the return that disappointed. There is a particular kind of hope that survives disappointment. Not the original hope, the clean and uncomplicated excitement that existed before anything went wrong. Something more cautious than that. A hope that knows it has already been let down once and is trying to protect itself while still remaining open to the possibility that things could be different this time. That was the quality of feeling that characterized the Tokyo Ghoul fan community in the years between the end of Route A in March 2015 and the announcement of Tokyo Ghoul Re in October 2017. The disappointment of Route A had been real and widely expressed. The conversation about what had gone wrong was detailed and ongoing. But the source material for a potential third season was genuinely extraordinary. Tokyo Ghoul Re, the sequel manga that Ishida had been serializing since October 2014, was by most accounts doing things that the original manga's anime adaptation had failed to do justice to. It was deeper, more complex, more ambitious in its thematic scope. Fans who had been following it weekly in Weekly Young Jump knew that the story it contained, if adapted with the care and faithfulness that Route A had withheld, could produce something that partially redeemed the franchise's anime reputation. That hope required patience. 3 years of it. Between the end of Route A and the announcement of the third season, the franchise maintained its presence in the community primarily through the ongoing manga serialization and through the kind of persistent cultural conversation that a series with a genuinely passionate fan base generates, even in the absence of new animated content. Unravel kept circulating. Kaneki's white hair kept appearing at conventions. The debates about Route A kept running in forum threads and comment sections. The franchise was not forgotten, but it was waiting. And the nature of what it was waiting for, whether the eventual anime return would acknowledge the failures of Route A or simply continue past them as though they had not happened, was a question that the community returned to regularly across those 3 years. The announcement came in October 2017, confirmed publicly through Sui Ishida's Twitter account. Tokyo Ghoul Re would receive an anime adaptation. Studio Pierrot would handle the production. The air date was set for April 2018. These details, taken together, produced a response in the fan community that was genuinely divided in a way that reflected everything the previous seasons had done to their trust. Some fans expressed cautious optimism. The source material was strong. The manga had been running long enough that there was a substantial body of work to adapt. Perhaps the lessons of Route A had been absorbed. Perhaps the production team would approach this adaptation with the fidelity and care that the first season had demonstrated and that Route A had abandoned. Other fans were considerably more skeptical. The involvement of Studio Pierrot, the studio that had produced Route A, was not a reassuring signal. And when further details about the production began to emerge, the skeptical position started to look like the more accurate one. The first significant concern was the director. Shuhei Morita, who had led both the first season and Route A, was not returning for Tokyo Ghoul Re. His replacement was Toshinori Watanabe, whose previous directing credits did not inspire the same level of confidence. Watanabe was not an unknown quantity in the industry, but his background did not suggest the kind of artistic sensibility that the material required. The first season had benefited specifically from Morita's ability to translate the manga's visual language into animated form with intelligence and intention. Whatever his constraints in Route A, the directorial craft had remained visible in places. Watanabe's appointment felt like a signal that the production was not prioritizing the same qualities that had made the first season work. The second, and more structurally serious concern, was the episode count. Tokyo Ghoul Re, the manga had been serializing since October 2014 and would continue until July 2018. By the time the anime premiered in April 2018, the manga contained well over 100 chapters of densely plotted material. The full run would reach 179 chapters across 16 volumes. The anime was given 24 episodes to cover this material, split into 2 cores of 12 episodes each, with the first airing from April to June 2018, and the second from October to December of the same year. The mathematics of this arrangement were immediately and obviously problematic to anyone who had been following the franchise. Route A had already demonstrated what happened when Tokyo Ghoul's complex, character-dense storytelling was compressed into too small a container. The first season had covered 66 chapters across 12 episodes and had already been criticized for the pace at which it moved. Tokyo Ghoul Re was now being asked to cover 179 chapters across 24 episodes. That was nearly 3 times the chapter density of the first season's compression ratio. The task was not merely difficult. It was, by most reasonable assessments, structurally impossible to execute well. The first core of Tokyo Ghoul Re, covering the opening 12 episodes, confirmed the fears that the episode count had generated, while also introducing a new set of problems that were specific to this adaptation's particular circumstances. The most immediately visible of these was the continuity issue created by Route A's deviation from the manga. Tokyo Ghoul Re the manga had been written as a direct continuation of the original manga's story, not as a continuation of Route A's alternate narrative. The characters and events it referenced, the history it assumed the reader was carrying, were drawn from the manga rather than from the anime's version of events. This created a situation in which the anime adaptation of Tokyo Ghoul Re was continuing from a previous anime season that had not told the story the sequel manga was continuing from. The production team chose to proceed without adequately explaining this discontinuity to the audience. Anime-only viewers who had watched Route A and were now watching Tokyo Ghoul Re were presented with a story that referenced history they had not seen, characters whose significance they had not been given the context to understand, and a narrative that assumed knowledge they did not have. The new protagonist introduced in Tokyo Ghoul Re illustrated this problem with particular clarity. Heisei Sasaki, the central figure of the sequel's opening arcs, was a CCG investigator with a complicated and deliberately obscured relationship to Kaneki's history. The manga had introduced him with the kind of careful, layered construction that Ishida had brought to Kaneki in the original series, building his character through detail and implication, before revealing the full shape of what his presence in the story meant. The anime adaptation moved through this material at a pace that stripped most of the layering away. Scenes that in the manga had been given room to accumulate meaning were compressed into moments that communicated their surface content without their depth. Relationships between Sasaki and the members of his CCG squad, the Quinx Squad, which the manga had developed with the same patience Ishida had brought to the Anteku relationships in the original series, were rendered in broad strokes that told the audience these relationships existed without making the audience feel them. The animation quality in the first core was inconsistent in ways that went beyond the normal variation of a television production. There were episodes where the visual standard was acceptable, where the character designs were on model and the action sequences were legible, and the direction made reasonable choices about how to present the material. There were also episodes where the production showed visible signs of strain, where character proportions shifted between cuts, where fight sequences that should have been kinetically exciting were rendered in ways that felt static and poorly constructed. The contrast between the visual ambition the material called for and what the production was able to deliver in the time available was frequently painful. Tokyo Ghoul Re. The manga contains some of Ishida's most visually dynamic and emotionally precise work. The anime was regularly unable to reproduce either quality. The second core, covering the final 12 episodes and adapting the concluding arcs of the manga, represented a further acceleration of every problem the first core had introduced. An entire major arc was cut from the beginning of the second core, the anime moving directly into later story material without the transitional sequences that would have made the jump comprehensible. The pacing became genuinely disorienting in ways that went beyond compression into something closer to incoherence. Major plot developments that the manga had built toward across dozens of chapters arrived in the anime without the preparation that gave them meaning. Characters made decisions that were not motivated by anything the anime had established. Revelations that in the manga landed with the weight of carefully constructed inevitability arrived in the anime as information rather than experience. Facts delivered to the audience rather than truths earned through the accumulated work of storytelling. The animation quality in the second core declined further from the already uneven standard of the first. Battle sequences that represented some of the most significant confrontations in the entire franchise's history were rendered with a flatness that bordered on the perfunctory. The visual language that Ishida had developed across hundreds of manga pages to communicate the specific quality of each character's movement and power was reduced to generic action choreography that could have belonged to any production. Descriptions of the second core's animation as resembling a slideshow at points were not simply hyperbolic fan frustration. They reflected something real about what had been produced and what it looked like on screen. The sound design and music represented the one consistent area of relative strength across both cores. Yutaka Yamada, who had composed the score for the first two seasons, returned to provide music for Tokyo Ghoul RA, and his work maintained a quality that the visual elements of the production could not match. The opening themes for both cores, Asphyxia by Ko Shu Nie for the first, and Catharsis by TK from Ling Tosite Segure for the second, were genuine musical accomplishments that served the tone of the material with intelligence. TK's return to the franchise for the second core's opening was a moment that carried genuine emotional resonance for fans who had been with the series since Unravel. But strong music sitting under weak animation and incoherent pacing could not compensate for what the visual and narrative elements of the production were failing to provide. By December 2018, when the final episode of Tokyo Ghoul RE aired, the verdict from the fan community was largely settled. The third and fourth seasons had not redeemed what Route A had damaged. They had added significantly to the damage. The promise of the first season, which had always remained as a kind of reference point for what the franchise might have been, now sat at a greater distance from the reality of what it had become. Manga readers who had hoped that the strength of Ishida's sequel material would force the production into greater fidelity were largely devastated by what they had seen done to it. Anime-only viewers were frequently lost in ways that had become too fundamental to navigate without external help. Videos explaining the plot of Tokyo Ghoul Rei to confused anime watchers accumulated significant view counts, a specific and telling metric for how thoroughly the adaptation had failed its audience. What the long wait between Route A and Tokyo Ghoul Rei had preserved was hope. What Tokyo Ghoul Rei delivered was the end of it. Not bitterly or dramatically, but in the quiet, deflating way that happens when something you wanted to believe in finally shows you clearly that it cannot be what you needed it to be. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The return of Tokyo Ghoul did not repair what Route A had broken. It confirmed that the damage was deeper than even the most pessimistic fans had fully accounted for. But something interesting happened alongside all of this disappointment. The franchise's decline did not kill the conversation around it. In some ways, it intensified it. And understanding why requires looking at what happened to the fandom itself. Section 8. How a fandom fractured. There is something worth understanding about the way fan communities respond to disappointment. The instinct, when looking at a fandom that has been let down by something it loved, is to expect that disappointment to produce silence. To expect people to quietly move on, to redirect their energy towards something that is actually giving them what they need, to let the failed thing fade into the background of the internet's endlessly moving conversation. That is sometimes what happens, but it is not what happened with Tokyo Ghoul. What happened with Tokyo Ghoul was more complicated, and in some ways more interesting than simple abandonment. The disappointment did not quiet the conversation, it transformed it. It gave the conversation a new set of tensions to work through, a new set of questions to argue about, a new internal geography of disagreement that kept the franchise present in online spaces, long after a cleaner, more satisfying adaptation might, paradoxically, have allowed it to recede into fond but quiet memory. To understand how the fandom fractured, it helps to understand the fault line that Route A created and that everything afterward deepened. Before Route A, the Tokyo Ghoul audience was essentially unified in its relationship to the material. They were manga readers and there were anime-only viewers. And those two groups had different levels of knowledge about the story, but they were not yet in fundamental disagreement about what the story was or what it meant. The first season had been faithful enough to the source that manga readers and anime viewers were largely watching the same thing. Their conversations, while sometimes marked by the gentle condescension that manga readers in any fandom can develop toward people who have not read the source, were not conversations across a deep divide. They were conversations between people who had encountered the same story through different mediums. Route A broke that. It broke it specifically and structurally because it created two versions of the story that were not reconcilable with each other. Manga readers had a version of events in the second half of the original story. Anime viewers had a different version. These versions shared certain surface elements, certain character names and locations and broad plot beats, but they diverged in ways that were consequential rather than incidental. The characters behaved differently. The events unfolded differently. The emotional logic connecting one event to the next was different. A manga reader and an anime viewer discussing Tokyo Ghoul after Route A were not simply people with different levels of knowledge about the same story. They were people who had experienced meaningfully different versions of it. And that difference shaped everything about how they read the characters, interpreted the events, and understood what the story was trying to say. This divide produced a specific kind of online conversation that was energetic and frequently heated and almost entirely unresolvable. Manga readers who tried to explain what Route A had omitted or changed were not simply sharing information. They were implicitly arguing that the anime viewers' experience of the story was incomplete in ways that mattered. Anime viewers who pushed back were not simply defending their preference for the animated medium. They were defending an experience that had been real and meaningful to them, that had produced genuine emotional responses, that deserved to be treated as a valid encounter with the material, even if it had not followed Ishida's specific plot choices. Neither position was wrong, exactly, but neither position could fully accommodate the other. The divide was structural rather than resolvable through better communication. What made this particular fandom fracture unusual was the way it continued to generate engagement rather than dissipating over time. Most fandom conflicts burn hot and then cool as the community moves on to whatever comes next. The Tokyo Ghoul conversation did not cool in the same way. It maintained a sustained heat across years, fed by several specific factors that kept it alive and active long after the initial confrontation between manga readers and anime viewers had played out its first cycle. One of those factors was the ongoing availability of the material itself. Tokyo Ghoul did not disappear from streaming platforms after its initial run. It remained accessible on services like Crunchyroll and Funimation throughout the period of its decline and afterward. New viewers continued to encounter it. People who had been too young to watch it during its original run reached the age where they were discovering anime and found Tokyo Ghoul waiting for them as a well-known title with a significant cultural footprint. These new viewers went through their own version of the original experience, watching the first season and finding it genuinely compelling, moving into Route A, and experiencing the same confusion and disappointment that the original audience had felt, and then bringing their fresh responses into communities where the conversation had been running for years. Their arrival consistently renewed the debate rather than allowing it to settle. Another factor was the cultural persistence of the franchise's most iconic elements. Unravel did not age out of relevance the way that many anime themes do. It remained a reference point in discussions of anime music that went well beyond discussions of Tokyo Ghoul specifically. New covers kept appearing. New listeners kept encountering it and following it back to the series that had produced it. Kaneki's white-haired design kept circulating in fan art communities and at conventions. The imagery of the franchise remained visible and actively shared in spaces where new people could encounter it and become curious about the story behind it. This visual persistence meant that Tokyo Ghoul was consistently being introduced to new audiences, even as the existing audience was processing its disappointment. And each new introduction created another wave of people discovering the gap between what the franchise's iconic elements promised and what the later seasons delivered. The question of blame also kept the conversation running in ways that a cleaner narrative of failure would not have. If Route A had simply been a bad adaptation produced by a studio that did not care about the source material, the conversation would have been simpler and would have resolved more quickly into a settled verdict. But the involvement of Sui Ishida in the alternate story direction, however constrained and qualified that involvement turned out to be, complicated the blame narrative in ways that the community kept returning to. Morita's Reddit AMA had provided information that redistributed responsibility across multiple parties: the production committee, the studio, the director, and to some degree, Ishida himself. Fans who wanted to assign clear blame found themselves unable to do so cleanly. The production committee had set impossible constraints. The studio had worked within those constraints imperfectly. The director had done what he could within the movement space he was allowed. Ishida had encouraged creative deviation, while his own ongoing manga was simultaneously running in ways that shaped what the anime could and could not do. Everyone had contributed to the outcome. Nobody had intended it. The unsatisfying complexity of that picture gave the conversation about what went wrong an ongoing life that a simpler story of clear villains would not have produced. The fracture within the fandom also expressed itself in the specific debates that emerged around Tokyo Ghoul. Where's anime adaptation and its relationship to the manga's ending? The conclusion of the Tokyo Ghoul Rei manga had itself been divisive among readers. Ishida's ending made choices that a portion of the readership found rushed or unsatisfying, and that portion had been vocal about its dissatisfaction. This meant that when the anime adapted the manga's ending in its own compressed and visually undermined form, the conversation became three-way rather than two-way. There were manga readers who defended Ishida's ending and condemned the anime's handling of it. There were manga readers who had already been dissatisfied with the ending and found the anime's version a confirmation of their concerns rather than a new disappointment. And there were anime-only viewers navigating an ending that had arrived without adequate preparation and was in any case built on a manga conclusion that was itself the subject of significant debate. These three groups were all discussing the same events and arriving at very different assessments, and the overlap between their conversations generated a sustained, argumentative energy that kept Tokyo Ghoul in active community discussion years after its anime run had concluded. What the fracture did to new viewers arriving at the franchise in the years after Tokyo Ghoul Re's conclusion was particularly significant and worth sitting with. A person discovering Tokyo Ghoul in 2020 or 2021 or later was not discovering it in the same condition it had been in during the summer of 2014. They were discovering it already wrapped in a complicated reputation, already surrounded by a community that had processed significant disappointment and had very strong and often contradictory opinions about what the franchise was and what it had failed to be. The first season still held up. Its quality was not diminished by what had come after it. But the experience of watching the first season in the knowledge that the seasons following it were widely considered failures was a different experience from watching it in the summer of 2014, when everything was still possible. The shadow of what came after fell across the beginning in ways that shaped how new viewers engaged with what was genuinely good about the early material. And yet, through all of this, the franchise did not collapse into irrelevance. The cultural footprint that Tokyo Ghoul had established in its moment of genuine strength proved durable in ways that the quality of its later seasons did not warrant on their own terms. The franchise remained a reference point. It remained a touchstone in conversations about adaptation quality and wasted potential, and what dark anime could be when it was handled with care. It remained something that people had feelings about, strong and specific and often contradictory feelings, which is a form of cultural presence that many more technically successful properties never achieve. The fandom had fractured. The conversation had grown complicated and divided, and at times exhausting. But the conversation was still happening, and as long as it was still happening, Tokyo Ghoul was still, in some sense, alive. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The fractured fandom kept Tokyo Ghoul present in a way its later seasons alone could never have sustained. But underneath the debates and the blame and the competing readings lived a quieter, more painful question. The community kept returning to, what could this have been, if it had been done right? That question leads somewhere specific, and it is where this story goes next. Section 9. What the manga deserved. There is a specific kind of grief that comes from knowing what something could have been. Not the ordinary disappointment of a thing that simply was not very good, which is uncomfortable but manageable. A verdict reached and then moved past without too much residual weight. This is something heavier than that. This is the grief that arrives when you can see clearly, with specific and detailed evidence, exactly what was possible, and you have to hold that vision alongside the reality of what was actually delivered, and the gap between the two is wide enough that it changes how you feel about the whole experience. The Tokyo Ghoul fan community, particularly the portion of it that had followed Sui Ishida's manga through its complete run, knew this grief with unusual precision. They were not imagining an idealized version of what the anime could have been. They had the manga in their hands. They knew exactly what the source material contained, and they knew, chapter by chapter and character arc by character arc, what a faithful adaptation would have looked like if the people responsible for producing it had made different choices. To sit with that question seriously, to ask what the manga actually deserved in terms of an anime adaptation, requires moving past the general complaint that the anime was unfaithful and getting specific about what was lost and why those specific losses mattered. The complaint that an adaptation departed from its source material is common and not always meaningful. Adaptations make changes. The medium of animation imposes different constraints than the medium of sequential art. Time is finite. Choices have to be made. Not every departure from source material represents a failure of care or intelligence. What made the departures in Tokyo Ghoul's case genuinely damaging was not simply that they happened, but that they consistently removed the elements of the source material that were doing the most important work: the character development, the moral complexity, the psychological precision, the thematic depth, and replaced them with surface-level spectacle that looked like the story without functioning like it. The arc that most clearly illustrates this is the one that Route A bypassed most completely: the extended story content covering the second half of the original Tokyo Ghoul manga that was set aside in favor of the alternate narrative. This material, running roughly from where the first season ended through to the Anteiku raid that concluded the original series, contains some of the most carefully constructed character work in the entire franchise. It was the portion of the manga where Ishida demonstrated most clearly that he was not simply telling an exciting dark fantasy story, but was building a genuine meditation on what violence does to the people who engage in it, regardless of which side of a conflict they occupy. The CCG investigators who had been introduced in the first season as morally complicated figures were given arcs in this material that deepened that complexity in ways the anime never approached. Kotaro Amon, whose presence in Route A had been reduced to a peripheral figure moving through events he could not adequately engage with, had one of the most significant character journeys in the original manga's second half. His growing awareness of the inadequacy of the frameworks he had built his identity around, the frameworks that told him ghouls were monsters and the CCG was righteous, and the violence he participated in was necessary and clean, was handled with a slowness and patience that reflected genuine understanding of how people actually change their minds about things that are central to their sense of self. That change does not happen in a single confrontation or revelation. It accumulates. It happens in small moments of dissonance that a person initially explains away before eventually running out of explanations. The manga gave Amon enough space to go through that process in a way that felt true. Route A gave him enough screen time to exist as a recognizable face in scenes that required a CCG presence. The Tsukiyama arc, which Route A essentially set aside entirely, represented another specific and significant loss. Shu Tsukiyama, the character known as the Gourmet, had been introduced in the first season as an antagonist whose defining characteristic was a sophisticated and predatory obsession with kaneki. He was memorable and visually distinct and carried a quality of theatrical menace that made him immediately engaging. But the manga's development of Tsukiyama across the later portions of the original series and into Tokyo Ghoul revealed dimensions of the character that his initial presentation had not suggested. His relationship with his family, with the people who served him and genuinely cared about him, and with his own grief when circumstances stripped him of the things he had organized his existence around, produced a portrait of someone considerably more complex than a stylish villain. The anime audience never received this portrait. Tsukiyama remained, for viewers who had only watched the anime, the theatrical antagonist from the first season, never developing into the figure the manga made him. This was not a minor omission. Tsukiyama's arc in Tokyo Ghoul was one of the sequel manga's most emotionally resonant storylines. An anime audience that had not seen his development in the original series was not equipped to engage with what his presence in the sequel meant. The question of what a faithful adaptation would have required structurally is worth engaging with directly, because it is not simply a rhetorical exercise. The manga's 143 chapters, adapted at a ratio that allowed genuine character development rather than constant compression, would have required somewhere between 36 and 48 episodes across 3 or 4 seasons to do the material genuine justice. This is not a radical suggestion. Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, which is consistently cited as the standard for faithful manga adaptation in the dark fantasy genre, adapted its 108-chapter manga across 64 episodes. That ratio allowed the adaptation to develop its large cast, build its emotional arcs with sufficient patience, and give its thematic content the space to breathe that thematic content requires in order to land with real weight rather than simply being present. A Tokyo Ghoul adaptation working at a comparable ratio would have looked very different from what was produced. It would have had time to show Amon's arc. It would have had time to develop the CCG's internal culture in ways that made the moral complexity of the conflict legible. It would have had time to trace Kaneki's psychology across his various transformations with the precision that Ishida's manga brought to those transitions. The comparison to Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood is not chosen arbitrarily. It is the comparison that the Tokyo Ghoul fan community itself has returned to most consistently when imagining what a redemptive adaptation might look like. Brotherhood was itself a second adaptation of its source material, produced after a first adaptation. The 2003 Fullmetal Alchemist series had deviated significantly from the manga by taking an original story direction in its second half. That deviation had been commercially successful and had its own defenders, but it had also left the door open for a second adaptation that would cover the complete manga faithfully. When Brotherhood arrived in 2009, it delivered something that most observers consider one of the finest anime adaptations ever produced. It honored its source material with consistency and intelligence. It gave its enormous cast the room they needed. It built its thematic arguments with care, and it demonstrated that a series which had already received a flawed first adaptation could be revisited and done correctly. The parallel to Tokyo Ghoul is obvious, and the community has been drawing it for years. The first season of Tokyo Ghoul is roughly analogous to the 2003 Fullmetal Alchemist in its relationship to the source material. Not a disaster, often genuinely good, but departing from the manga in its second half in ways that compromise the complete story. Route A and Tokyo Ghoul. We are not analogous to anything in the Full Metal Alchemist story because Full Metal Alchemist did not have equivalents to what those seasons produced. The Tokyo Ghoul franchise is still waiting for its brotherhood moment. Whether that moment will ever arrive is a question the fan community has been asking with varying degrees of hope and resignation for years. And as of the time of this analysis, no official announcement of a remake has been made. The 10th anniversary of the original anime's premiere brought a special project announcement and new illustrations from Ishida himself, which generated significant excitement and speculation. But a full remake, structured with the episode count and the fidelity to the source material that the manga deserves, has not materialized. What would need to be true for a remake to succeed is also worth considering, because the answer is more specific than simply producing more episodes with better animation. A faithful Tokyo Ghoul adaptation would need to make certain structural commitments from the beginning that the original anime either did not make or made only partially. The most fundamental of these is the commitment to developing the CCG's side of the story with the same investment as the Ghoul side. The moral architecture of Ishida's world depends on both sides of the conflict being inhabited by people the audience can understand from the inside. When the CCG investigators are reduced to background antagonists, as Route A tended to reduce them, the story loses the specific quality that separates it from a conventional dark fantasy narrative. A remake would need to give characters like Amon and the investigators who come after him in Tokyo Ghoul RA the screen time and the scene work necessary to make them people rather than functions. A faithful adaptation would also need to handle Kaneki's psychological journey with greater care than the anime managed. One of the most consistently underappreciated qualities of Ishida's original manga is the precision with which it tracked Kaneki's internal state across his various transformations. Each version of Kaneki, the frightened new half-ghoul, the white-haired figure who emerged from the torture arc, the subsequent versions who appeared across the story's later portions, was distinguished not just by visual markers, but by specific, identifiable shifts in how he thought, what he valued, what he was afraid of, and what he was no longer capable of. The anime compressed these distinctions in ways that made Kaneki's various states feel more interchangeable than they were in the source material. A remake would need to slow down enough to let the audience inhabit each version of Kaneki as a distinct psychological reality rather than as a progression of aesthetic changes. The Tokyo Ghoul material presents its own specific challenges for any future adaptation. The sequel manga's opening arcs, built around Heisei Sasaki and the Quinx Squad, are structured around a slow, layered reveal that requires patience from the adaptation in order to work. The audience needs to spend enough time with Sasaki to know his rhythms and his habits and the specific texture of his daily life before the revelations about his identity can land with the weight they are designed to carry. The original anime adaptation gave these opening arcs nowhere near enough time. A scene that the manga built across multiple chapters was rendered in minutes. A relationship that Ishida developed across dozens of pages of small, quiet moments was communicated in a single conversation that told the audience the relationship existed without making them feel it. These are the kinds of failures that a remake would need to actively resist, which means building in the episode count before production begins, rather than discovering mid-production that there is not enough room for what the material requires. The animation question is real, but secondary to the structural question. There is a version of this conversation that focuses primarily on visual quality, on the decline in animation between the first season and the later entries, on the slideshow comparisons, and the off-model character designs, and the poorly constructed fight sequences. Those criticisms are legitimate. The visual dimension of the later seasons was genuinely inadequate for material that required visual ambition. But animation quality, while important, is not the foundational issue. A Tokyo Ghoul re-adaptation produced with beautiful animation but the same 24-episode count and the same structural decisions would still have failed to tell the story. The problem was never primarily that the later seasons looked bad, though they did. The problem was that they did not have the architecture necessary to carry the story they were attempting to tell. Architecture comes first. Animation serves architecture. A remake that prioritized visual quality over episode count and structural fidelity would be producing a more beautiful version of the same failure. Ishida's own complicated relationship with the franchise adds a layer of meaning to all of this that is worth acknowledging. He has described the manga in terms that are unexpectedly self-critical for someone whose work achieved the commercial success it did. He has spoken about feeling that he did not fully realize what he was trying to do. He has expressed gratitude that people engaged with the work at all, in terms that suggest surprise rather than confidence. These statements, taken together, paint a picture of a creator who was pushing at the limits of his abilities across a 7-year period of intense production pressure, and who emerged from that experience with a complicated assessment of the result. A remake would not be for Ishida in the sense of vindicating him or correcting something he felt he had done wrong. The manga is what it is, and it is genuinely extraordinary in the ways that matter most. A remake would be for the story, for the specific, detailed, emotionally precise narrative that Ishida built across 322 total chapters, and that the anime never adequately translated into animated form. The fans who have been calling for a remake across the years since Tokyo Ghoul Re's conclusion are not simply expressing nostalgia or an abstract desire for better quality. They are expressing something more specific than that. They are saying that the story they read in Ishida's manga was one that moved them in real and lasting ways, that contained characters they genuinely cared about and themes that stayed with them, and moments of emotional precision that they have not forgotten, and that all of that deserves to exist in animated form, with the care and the space and the structural fidelity that it has not yet received. That is a reasonable thing to want. It is, in fact, exactly the kind of thing that a community forms around a piece of storytelling to say, "We believe this mattered. We believe it deserves better than what it got." We are still here, years later, saying so. Whether anyone with the authority and the resources to act on that belief will do so remains an open question. The 10th anniversary project suggested that the franchise is not considered dormant by the people who hold it. Ishida's continued presence in the manga world through his ongoing series Chojin X demonstrates that his creative voice is still active and still finding readers. The conversation in the fan community, fractured and complicated as it has become, demonstrates that the audience for a faithful adaptation still exists and is still paying attention. The ingredients for a Tokyo Ghoul remake are present in the world. What is missing is the decision to make one, made by people willing to commit to doing it correctly rather than quickly. That decision has not yet been made. But the story that would justify it is sitting there, unchanged and undiminished, in the pages of Sui Ishida's manga, waiting with the particular patience of something that knows it is worth the wait. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The manga has been waiting for the adaptation it deserves since 2014. That wait continues. But whatever happens next with the franchise, whatever decisions are eventually made about its future, there is already a legacy in place. And that legacy is more complicated and more interesting than a simple story of failure. The final part of this story is about what Tokyo Ghoul actually left behind, and why some of it turned out to be remarkably durable. Section 10. The legacy that outlived the fall. Every story about decline eventually has to reckon with what survives the declining. The fall of Tokyo Ghoul as an anime franchise is well documented at this point, traced across seasons and production decisions and community fractures, and the slow accumulation of disappointment that replaced the excitement of the summer of 2014. That story is real, and it is worth telling honestly, which is what this essay has attempted to do across the sections that came before this one. But a story told only as a fall, only as a record of what went wrong and what was lost, and what could have been different, is an incomplete story. Because something did survive. Several things survived, and some of them survived with a durability that the quality of the later seasons does not explain and cannot account for. Understanding what Tokyo Ghoul actually left behind, in the culture and in the community, and in the broader landscape of anime and manga, requires sitting with the evidence of that survival and asking honestly why it happened. The most immediately visible piece of surviving legacy is a song. Unravel, released on July 23, 2014, performed by TK from Ling Tosite Segure, peaked at number 9 on the Oricon singles chart in Japan during the week of its release. That chart position was a signal of the song's initial commercial success. What the chart position could not predict was what the song would become across the years that followed. Anime opening themes exist in large numbers. Thousands of them have been produced across the decades of the medium's history. A small number of them achieve genuine cultural penetration, moving from the specific context of the series they were made for into broader musical consciousness, where they can be appreciated and engaged with by people who have never watched the show that generated them. Unravel is in that small number. More than a decade after its release, it continues to circulate in ways that most anime themes, including themes from considerably more successful and consistently praised series, do not. The cover culture that grew around Unravel is one of the more remarkable phenomena associated with the franchise. Within weeks of the first season's premiere, musicians were producing their own versions and uploading them to YouTube. These were not casual fan recordings, though many of those existed too. Serious musicians, people with genuine technical skill and artistic investment, were drawn to the song specifically because it rewarded serious engagement. The melodic structure was complex enough that covering it well required real effort. The vocal performance in the original, TK's distinctive approach that blended fragility with intensity in ways that were technically demanding to reproduce, set a high standard that made a successful cover feel like an accomplishment rather than simply a recording exercise. Piano arrangements of Unravel accumulated millions of views. Orchestral versions were produced. Covers in English, in Mandarin, in Spanish, in a range of other languages demonstrated that the song's emotional content was legible across linguistic contexts, that what it was communicating did not depend entirely on understanding the Japanese lyrics. The lyrics themselves, for those who took the time to seek out translations, added a layer of appreciation that rewarded the effort. They were not generic emotional content dressed up in anime aesthetics. They were specific. They spoke directly to Kaneki's experience of having been split into something that could not be made whole again, of trying to remain present to the people he loved while feeling himself becoming less visible and less real, of the terror of transformation without consent. "Tell me, oh tell me, the way it works, who is that inside of me?" Lines like that, translated carefully, communicated something that resonated beyond the specific fictional context that produced them. People who had never watched Tokyo Ghoul heard the song, sought out translations, and found themselves affected by the content in ways that had nothing to do with the anime. The song had enough genuine artistic substance to stand independently of the franchise. That is an unusual quality, and it is a significant part of why the song's cultural presence has remained active while the franchise's reputation has been so thoroughly complicated by the failures of its later seasons. At anime conventions around the world, Unravel has maintained a presence that most songs from series released in the same period have not. Convention orchestras included in medley performances. Cosplayers in Kaneki's various looks, the black-haired version from early in the first season, the white-haired version from the torture arc's conclusion, the masked versions representing different stages of his transformation, appear in numbers that suggest ongoing affection for the character rather than simple nostalgia for a specific season. The visual identity of the franchise proved similarly durable. Kaneki's half-black, half-white mask remained one of the more recognizable costumes in anime convention spaces well into the 2020s, which is a significant duration for a design associated with a series whose anime adaptation ended in disappointment. The mask worked because it communicated something simply and powerfully. It did not require knowledge of the story to read as a symbol of division and conflict. It was visually efficient in the way that truly iconic design is always visually efficient, carrying its meaning in its shape rather than depending on context to explain it. The franchise's impact on the broader landscape of dark anime in the years following its peak is another dimension of its legacy that tends to be under-acknowledged in conversations dominated by the quality of the adaptation. Tokyo Ghoul arrived in 2014 at a moment when dark psychological anime was present but not dominant in the commercial mainstream. Attack on Titan had opened a door. Tokyo Ghoul walked through it and held it open wider. The specific combination of elements that Tokyo Ghoul brought together, urban setting, moral ambiguity between human and monster, psychological horror grounded in identity rather than simple fear, a protagonist whose transformation was psychological as much as physical, influenced the development of subsequent dark anime in ways that are visible, without requiring specific documented statements of influence. Chainsaw Man, which premiered in 2022 and became one of the most discussed dark anime of its era, shares structural DNA with the kind of storytelling that Tokyo Ghoul helped establish as commercially viable. Demon Slayer, which became a phenomenon of an entirely different scale, operates in a generic space that Tokyo Ghoul's success helped validate. The specific character of Ken Kaneki, a gentle person forced by circumstances into violence he did not seek and cannot fully integrate, became a template that subsequent dark anime protagonists were built in relationship to, either following the template or deliberately departing from it. The manga's commercial numbers represent another dimension of the legacy that resists being explained away by the quality of the adaptation. Over 47 million copies in circulation worldwide by January 2021. That figure places the Tokyo Ghoul franchise among the best-selling manga series in the history of the medium, in company with titles like Bleach and Naruto and Dragon Ball that shaped the global understanding of what manga could be and do. The anime's failures did not destroy those numbers. They may in fact have contributed to them in a specific and counterintuitive way. The controversy generated by Route A and Tokyo Ghoul Re sent a significant number of frustrated anime viewers to the manga to find the story they felt the anime had failed to deliver. Some of those viewers became committed manga readers who completed the full run across both the original series and Tokyo Ghoul Re, and came away with an appreciation for the source material that they would not have developed if the anime had satisfied them. The failures of the adaptation, in other words, drove some portion of the audience toward the thing that the adaptation had failed to honor. The manga benefited, in terms of readership, from the very disappointment that the anime generated. Sui Ishida's own post-Tokyo Ghoul career offers a specific kind of evidence about the lasting impact of what he built. His subsequent manga series, Shojin X, which began serialization in Weekly Young Jump in October 2021, attracted immediate and significant attention from readers who had followed his work through Tokyo Ghoul and Tokyo Ghoul Ari. The expectation was high because the baseline was high. Readers came to Shojin X already knowing that Ishida was capable of specific and emotionally precise work, already trusting his visual sensibility and his ability to build moral complexity into the architecture of a story, rather than applying it as surface decoration. Shojin X has been received warmly by critics and readers who appreciate what it is doing and can see the continuity between its concerns and the concerns of Ishida's previous work. The audience that Tokyo Ghoul built for Ishida as a creator transferred, with notable fidelity, to his next project. That is evidence of something real. Readers who follow a creator from one work to the next across years are readers who developed a genuine relationship with that creator's voice, not simply with a single story. The academic attention that Tokyo Ghoul has received represents a dimension of its legacy that is easy to overlook in fan community discussions focused on adaptation quality and commercial performance, but that reflects something meaningful about what the franchise achieved at its best. Ishida's work has been engaged with in academic contexts, examining questions of identity, otherness, the ethics of violence, and the representation of marginalized experience through the metaphor of the monstrous. A University of Milan paper examined the food ethics embedded in the story's treatment of ghouls and their relationship to human life. Research published in medical and psychological adjacent academic contexts examined the transplantation narrative and what it communicated about questions of identity and bodily integrity. These engagements were not with the anime, which had not developed the source material's thematic content with sufficient depth to sustain academic analysis. They were with the manga, with the specific arguments Ishida had built into the structure of the story across 7 years of serialization. The fact that scholars found material worth engaging with in those pages is not a trivial data point. It suggests that what Ishida built had genuine intellectual substance beneath its genre surface. Substance that the anime largely failed to translate, but that existed independently of the translation. The 10th anniversary of the original anime's premiere in 2024 generated a response from the fan community that was itself a form of evidence about the franchise's enduring presence. An anniversary celebration for a property that had genuinely faded from cultural relevance would produce mild nostalgic engagement from a diminished community. What the 10th anniversary produced was something more active than that. Ishida released new illustrations marking the occasion. A special anime project was announced, though the specific nature of that project had not been fully detailed at the time of this analysis. Fan communities that had been processing their relationship with the franchise's failures for years found themselves, in the context of the anniversary, in something closer to the original spirit of engagement that the first season had generated. Not naive excitement, nothing like what existed in the summer of 2014, but a genuine, complicated affection that acknowledged the history of disappointment while remaining open to the possibility of something better. That affection is perhaps the most honest measure of what the franchise actually meant to the people who gave their time and emotional investment to it. The fans who remained active in Tokyo Ghoul spaces years after the anime's conclusion were not people who had failed to process what happened. They were not people holding on to an illusion. They were people who had processed it fully, who understood exactly what had gone wrong and why, who had argued about it across years of detailed and often heated conversation, and who still cared. Still cared about Ken Kaneki as a character. Still cared about Toka Kirishima and the specific quality of her presence in the story. Still cared about the world Ishida had built, with its coffee shop and its masked ghouls and its CCG investigators who were doing terrible things for reasons that made a kind of sense if you understood them from the inside. The caring survived the disappointment. That is not always what happens. Sometimes disappointment kills the feeling entirely, burns out the investment so completely that nothing warm remains. With Tokyo Ghoul, the feeling survived. Damaged, complicated, carrying the weight of what had not been honored, but surviving. Kaneki's story, at its core, was about exactly this, about what survives transformation, about what remains of a person when circumstances have taken from them the things they believed were essential to who they were. Kaneki lost his human life in the most literal sense imaginable. He lost his ability to eat normal food, to move through the world without fear of what he was, to be the quiet, bookish student who had seemed so completely to know what his life was going to look like. He lost friends. He lost versions of himself that he had invested in deeply before circumstances made them untenable. And across the manga's long and painful arc, what the story traced was the question of what persisted through all of that loss. What remained of Ken Kaneki when everything that was removable had been removed? The answer the manga arrived at was not a triumphant one. It was not a story of a person who lost everything and discovered that strength was what remained. It was more complicated and more honest than that. What remained was the capacity to keep trying, to keep caring about the people around him even when caring was dangerous, to keep reaching for something like peace in a world that was structured to make peace nearly impossible for someone in his position. That is a smaller and more real kind of survival than the genre often allows its protagonists. The franchise's own history mirrors that arc in a way that is either ironic or fitting, depending on how you read it. Tokyo Ghoul lost the things that should have been essential to its identity as an anime. It lost the fidelity to its source material. It lost the careful character development. It lost the visual ambition. It lost the structural integrity that the first season had promised. It lost the trust of significant portions of its audience in ways that were real and lasting. And what remained, after all of that loss, was the capacity to keep being present, to keep circulating in the culture through the song and the imagery and the community that had formed around the best version of what it had been, to keep being something that people had feelings about, to keep being the reference point in conversations about wasted potential and what adaptation owed its source material, and what dark anime could achieve when everything was working correctly. That is not nothing. In a medium and a cultural landscape that produces new content at a pace that makes sustained attention genuinely rare, remaining present across a decade despite significant and well-documented failures represents something. The franchise that Tokyo Ghoul became was not the franchise it deserved to be. The anime that was produced from Ishida's manga was not the anime the manga earned. These are true statements and they matter, but they do not exhaust what is true about Tokyo Ghoul's place in the history of anime and manga. Also true is that a song called Unravel changed what anime audiences believed an opening theme could do. Also true is that an image of a boy with white hair and a cracked mask entered the visual vocabulary of a global fan community and has not left it. Also true is that 47 million copies of Ishida's manga found readers around the world who were moved by what they encountered in those pages. Also true is that the story of Ken Kaneki, a gentle person transformed by circumstances he did not choose into something he had to learn to inhabit, resonated with enough people deeply enough that they are still talking about it years after the anime that introduced most of them to it concluded in disappointment. The fall of Tokyo Ghoul is a real story. The rise that preceded it was also real, and the legacy that survived both of them is real as well, complicated and imperfect, and carrying the weight of what could have been different, but present, still present, which is, when you think about it, exactly what Kaneki's story was always about. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe and I'll see you in the next video.